Welcome to the next video in the writing framework. In the last video, we spoke about the first component in the writing framework, which is purpose. So now you should be able to identify the purpose, determine the type of message, and based on the type of message, you should know what structure you want to use. Now we are going to look at the next two components, audience and tone, and see how all of this comes together to give you clarity on exactly how and what you should be writing. So let's move on to our second component, which is audience. Now, what exactly do we need to understand from this component? It's very, very simple. Our audience plays a major role when it comes to our writing. The way we write is always dependent on who we are writing to. Therefore, we need to determine our audience, who they are, why do they need this information, what do they need to know, and how much do they actually need to know in terms of your message. And then what is an action that they need to take, being the reader or the recipient of this message, and what is your relationship with them, what is your rapport with them, what kind of formality level you have with them, which is going to affect the overall message as well. Therefore, determining your audience or the recipients of your message will always help ensure that your message goes out with the right tone. Which brings us to the third and final component of the writing framework, the tone of your message. Now, the tone of your message is important not only in verbal but also in written communication. When you're speaking, your body language also comes into play and therefore helps with setting the right tone when you're speaking to somebody. However, when you're writing, it's just the message that needs to convey the tone, and therefore it is very important that we use the right tone of voice, especially when you're writing. Now, it is rightly said, almost all our conflicts are always due to the tone of your voice. It always comes down to, it's not about what you said, it's how you said it. And when it comes to a written message, there is something called reading between the lines, where you tend to read a message and then interpret it in your own perspective based on what you think the tone is. Therefore, it is very important that when you write with the right tone. Before we get into tone, we need to know our purpose of the message, the type of the message, the structure that we are going to use, and also who are we writing this message to. Based on these four things, it'll be easy for us to use the right kind of tone in our message. Irrespective of the kind of message, whether it's positive, neutral, or negative, to add the right tone, to have that professional, polite tone, we are going to look at three things. What should you avoid? What should you focus on? And what should you add? So let's get into it. We are going to start off by talking about what should you avoid. We have already discussed this before. You never start or end anything negatively. So do not start with a negative message, a negative verbiage in the very beginning or at the very end. It does not set the right tone for your message. Whether you're beginning the message with a negative or ending with the negative message, it always affects the person who is reading, and thereby you want to avoid it. Now, the next thing is avoiding blame game. Often people would jump into what you should have done, what should have happened, this is what you should have done, these are the problems, who did this, you did this. All this is basically a blame game. We want to avoid the blame game. Instead of focusing on what happened, we need to focus on what is the next step. Therefore, avoid placing blame with your sentences, with the words that you use, and that will help you with your tone as well. The last thing is, not entire sentences are negative. Certain words or phrases are only negative. Therefore, you want to avoid those negative words and replace them with neutral sounding words, which will reduce the harshness of the message altogether. For example, instead of using the word error or mistake, using the word issue or bug or challenge is a little better or slightly more neutral sounding than error or mistake. So slightly toning down the usage of your words will help. Another thing that you can do to avoid sounding negative is use passive voice instead of active voice, because with the passive voice you can altogether remove the subject, which will help in removing the blame, and therefore it focuses only on the challenge or the issue at hand. Now that we have learned what you should avoid, let's look at what you should focus instead. We want to focus the message on being more reader-centric, which means that you want to consider whom you're writing this message to, the audience that it is meant for, your relationship with them, your rapport with them, and ensure that it does not get affected. We can do this by also focusing on the solution. Now, instead of focusing on the problem and what could have done, what should have been done, we focus more on what should be the next steps. What should we do? What is a plan of action? When you focus on the solution, it automatically brings in a positive light. And the last step is positive phrasing. We learned not to use negative words or phrases, but what we can always do is use positive or neutral sounding words and phrases wherever possible. For example, saying what can be done instead of what can't be done is a positive light to a negative situation. The last aspect is, what do we add to our message? The first thing that you need to add is empathy. Empathy is key to ensuring that your message goes out with the right tone of voice. Now, it is not about empathy only for negative statements. Empathy in the sense that always put yourself in your reader's shoes when you write your message. Is this the kind of message that you want to receive? Therefore, be a little careful, empathize with the other person, and always think about them when you're writing. The next thing is making your message more inclusive with the use of personal pronouns like I, we, us. Let us to work together. I would love to help you with this. Let's put our heads together and figure out a solution. Instead of telling what to do, make it sound more inclusive and use active voice here. And this would really help in bringing about an aspect of support. And the last thing is sincerity. Now, you can say I understand or I'm sorry, but if you don't actually mean it, trust me, your words will convey the exact same thing. You want to actually be sorry when you're saying I'm sorry, and you want to actually understand when you say I understand. Therefore, think about the other person, be in their shoes, empathize with them, and based on that, write your message, and that will make a massive difference. Because just a message that says I'm sorry is not going to do the job unless you actually feel it. I hope that all these tips will help you balance and get that right tone of voice when you write your message. Let's look at a few examples. The first statement where they're saying the service department has regularly failed to deliver monthly worksheets. Now, if you look at it, the negative word is failed, and then extreme adjectives like regularly is just adding to the negativity of the statement. So how do we reduce it is by just changing that negative phrase into saying they have been struggling to deliver. And this changes the aspect altogether. And if you add to it by saying, let us work on figuring out how to deal with this, then it automatically gives a more supportive and a collaborative approach. So you would want to change the negative phrasing. This example, instead of saying what you can't do, you talk about what you can do. Though it might still not be the most favorable thing that your client or the person who's getting the message is getting, they will still have a positive impact because you're still giving them an idea of when something can happen. The last one, monitoring procedures are inadequate. Now, passive voice has been used here, and this still sounds very negative in the sense that something is not right. Whereas this can be changed into a more positive, supportive, and collaborative sentence by using active voice and say, let us improve monitoring procedures. It still denotes that there's something not enough with the current monitoring procedure, but not in a negative sense, but more from a collaborative and supportive approach. So let's work on this thing together. Now, this example is not very rude or abrupt. It is very clear cut, and most of the time, this is what people think. My messages are to the point. They don't find anything rude or abrupt with them. But when another person is reading it, it can sound abrupt. Like this statement, you make presentations that demonstrate new products. Be sure you share ideas in a clear, concise, and effective way. It sounds very normal, but this also can be reframed into something that is more positive and something that sets a better tone. So let's look at it. For example, thank you for presenting and demonstrating our new projects. Because we face greater competition, I would appreciate if you would assess your presentation. We need to be certain all our presentations are as clear and concise and effective. So if you want any help, let me know. So what this does is, so this is the same message but conveyed in a less authoritative manner and a slightly more assertive manner instead, and it does not damage the rapport between the two people because you are appreciating, you're sharing the reasons why they should do something differently, and you're still ending it with a collaborative approach. So let me help, I would love to help. So that is a great way of ending the message. Empathy is there throughout the entire piece. Let's look at another one. The fact remains that bad news message is one that your reader does not want to receive. How do you plan to deliver it? Now, again, it's very to the point, matter of fact, and does not have any empathy at all. So, reframing this by using active voice would be a great way of doing this. For example, I realize that this is not a pleasant task. Can I help you in any way? Now, this is supportive, collaborative, and very empathetic. So even the most basic of sentences sometimes might sound okay to you, might sound right to you, but to another person, they might sound a little rude, arrogant, abrupt, and not in the tone that you want them to actually receive. The challenge is because the other person reads it in their own way, they sometimes read between the lines as well, and it is their own perception. So, what you want to do as a writer is ensure that it goes out in the tone of voice that you want them to take away. So, here's one for you to try. Now, as you can see, this is an actually easy one because it's very to the point and clear. I see that you are late with your line evaluation forms again. Your personal problems have resulted in inability to perform your duties and cutting down G sector's efficiency, putting us all behind schedule. Such laziness is beyond acceptable parameters and will not be tolerated. This is genuinely a negative message that is being conveyed in a not so good manner, and this can obviously be reframed into something better. Take this as a task, and I would love for you to reframe this entire thing and share it in the comments, and I would love to check your message out. Now let's understand how do you create a personal voice based off what we learned about tone. Assess your relationship with the other person because that is what we are basing this writing on. Now, based on the level of formality is where you will adjust the formality in your message as well. So you want to take the time to draft and ensure that you have the right intention. The right intention being not to hurt the other person, not to place blame on the other person, not to focus on the problem, instead focus on the solution, have a more empathetic, collaborative and supportive approach to this. You want to avoid any kind of SMS lingo, emoticons and jargons based on the person that you are writing to. We have a tendency to use a lot of exclamations, ellipses and smileys, emojis. So what we want to do is actually convey our feelings in a better manner when you're writing, and therefore don't use or overuse any exclamation points, etc., and so on and so forth. And finally, you proofread it to ensure that the tone is right. If you are not sure if it sounds right, you can always get somebody else to read it and they can tell you if it sounds good or maybe it is coming off in the wrong sense. So get help to proofread it for tone. And this is how you create your personal voice. Depending on the person, you would change the way you write it. And I hope that this entire piece helps you get your message across with the right tone of voice. And that is the end of the writing framework. We determine our purpose, figure out the type of message, identify the structure, then we know who it is that we are writing to. And based on that, we ensure that we write with the right tone of voice. I hope that this entire section helped you get more clarity on how you're supposed to write your messages so that they are effective and they go out in the right sense. I have added a tip sheet or a cheat sheet for you for this entire framework. Feel free to download it and keep this handy so that when you're writing, you have everything that you need to always refer back to. In the next section, we are going to learn how to take this framework and enhance your writing in different modes of communication. And I will see you in the next section.